Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I've written books on terrorism and on civil liberties and human rights, a lot. My daughter says, why do you always write the same book? And I was trying to point out they're subtly different, but they are. The breakthrough in trying to understand what I would do with this book came when I realized, that claims it as truth, but when it dawned on me that liberty and security are not difficult terms to understand. What's interesting is not about their meaning, on which more in a moment, but their range, their breadth, whom they reach. There isn't an awful lot of anxious intellectual consideration of the meanings of liberty and security, though I use Hobbes and the Levellers as roots into a reflection on the term. And by liberty, I mean not only the freedom from the state, I mean also the freedom to those necessities to lead a successful life, free from unnecessary ill health, to be free from poverty, to have access to educational opportunity, and security is to be able, of course, to enjoy your liberty without external attack, naturally. But security is also integrally connected to liberty in that it is the guarantee that enables you to be able to lead that free life without undue fragility, without undue threat. Opportunities are left to you. The state provides you with some degree, there's an obligation in this, some degree of safeguards against calamitous misfortune. The most frequent way in which the notion of security is conceptualized is national security. And I was thinking about individual security, but also an individual's entitlement to something like social security. Security is about the opportunity to flourish without being exposed to unnecessary misfortune, liberty and security. So those, in a way, were the ways in which I approached the terms. And now on remit, it's fairly clear that a percentage of persons have always enjoyed liberty and security. And that's usually been as a consequence of their birth fortune or financial fortune or both. What has happened in the last 400 to 500 years is the way in which we have as a culture, and there's a lot of complicated stuff about who we are and the interrelationship between the we that is formed by Anglo-American ideas and the world we, which I can't get into, but could well be something we want to discuss. The we has moved in a direction of universality. So what we have seen has been an understanding that liberty and security should be, as it were, presumptively for all. I see there are being three main ideas that have driven the universalization of liberty and security. Each of them, as I say, in a way that I'll detail, having their own flaws. And they're pretty obvious. The first is obviously, and the greatest driver of universalism of all, is democracy. The idea that everybody counts finds its finest expression in this extraordinary notion that you are entitled to participate in the election of your leaders, notwithstanding your lack of intelligence, notwithstanding your gender, notwithstanding your illness, and I would say notwithstanding your incarceration, though that is a current contemporary anxiety in our culture. And that this democratic drive has unlocked a commitment to universalism which has done wonders to open up a rich reading of liberty for all and a rich reading of security for all. And I use, as a route into this, the remarkable documents produced by the Levellers in the 1640s, in which they argue for what is recognizably a universal commitment to liberty and security through democratic representation, and also through the second and third of my universals, the rule of law and human rights. But this democratic drive has its own flaw. And the flaw is that it is a democratic drive in Britain, in America, everywhere, which has built upon previous structures of inequality. And I myself think that's inevitable, and you work with it. Some of you who know your Marx will remember the 19th century debates about whether you bother with democracy. I hope I would have been on the side of my Kentish Town resident Edward Bernstein in the 19th century in arguing that democracy is not a cynical move to decide which of the butchers should butcher us, but that democracy is a route towards universalism. Having said that, there is force in the criticism that a democratic system laid on a structure of inequality is a democratic system that is going to replicate preceding democratic unequal structures. We've never fully addressed that. We've done our best, primarily by trying to control expenditure at elections, primarily by trying to retain balance in the election process, primarily by maintaining commitments to independent voices in a plural mass media. We've been aware of it, and we've sought to remedy the effects which would flow from an overconcentration of power being able to transform a democratic engagement. The second of the universalisms, which I used to be quite skeptical of, but which I now think is a social good, is the rule of law. And the rule of law, insofar as it means that everybody is to be judged in accordance with the law, is a remarkable example of universalism. That rule of law is then overseen by an independent judiciary, an unelected community of non-governmental, confident, cultured men and women who are independent in every sense, not caring about whether they please or don't please government, is a remarkable universal advance for liberty and security. The flaws in the development of the rule of law are that both Hobbes's approach to liberty and Republican approaches to liberty allow the state a tremendous say when it comes to the protection of the state, and that protection of the state, which necessitates an invasion of liberty in the name of security, is something which courts generally accept. So for all the talk of the rule of law, and for all the excellence of the judges in the universal application of the rule of law, under any model, even in the democratic era, of law, there are permissions to the executive to act in extremis. And we see that played out in case after case after case, where, for example, those on the outside can be designated enemies of the state, where those who find their property being taken or themselves being incarcerated can be told, as they were told in a case in 1920, I think, or not, just after or at the end of the First World War, the safety of the state is the supreme law. So the rule of law is universal, but only up to a point. The third universal, which has driven this move towards universal liberty and security, is predictably, a bit late in the day, but successfully, human rights. The Universal Declaration is my starting point. It could be earlier. It's 1948, it's the 1960s. And universal human rights are reaching both liberty in the narrow sense, my freedom, liberty in the broader sense, my flourishing life, and security as well, in that it's attempting to guarantee the individual from really what Roosevelt, FDR might have called, you know, the fears. The fears. And so universal human rights is a very nice way of articulating a commitment to liberty and security which is aimed at everyone. And that's, of course, one of our big stories. Now, that's been social progress, all three, in the last few hundreds of years. It's a big deal. I believe something has been changing. Since 1989, we've had an explosion of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. We have had an apparent universalization of our universals because we have had the collapse of the Soviet regimes, we've had consequent constitution building, and we've seen in so many countries in Eastern and Central Europe, and parenthetically a bit earlier, in newly decolonized territories, commitments to Anglo-American kinds of constitutions with bills of rights, with the rule of law, and with democracy. When the socialist alternative to capitalism is destroyed, however temporarily, we see the hegemony of my universalizing ideas. But the universalizing ideas are taking place, and this is where it gets tricky, in an economic environment which we call, for sake of an argument, neoliberalism. In an economic environment which is suggestive of a minimal role for the state, which is suggestive of a much narrower reading of liberty, and which is suggestive of, essentially, the market as the driver of truth. So we have a kind of radical tension between these various structures which are universal and a commitment to an economic process which is very market-driven, and the market is inheriting power as the market finds it. Now, we have therefore got the paradox. And the paradox is that you have got more inequality, greater need, greater want, at a time when you have greater human rights protection, greater rule of law, and greater democracy. So what's going on? And the advances towards universal liberty and security are being wrested back. And they're being wrested back in a non-explicit way, but in a way which has not yet got, as it were, the courage, or if you prefer, the effrontery, to reveal itself. And that this is happening to each of our three, and each of our three is exploiting flaws in the universalisms that they are seeking to control or manage. Take democracy. The flaw with democracy was its susceptibility to manipulation by power. And one of the characteristics of the recent past has been the increased brazenness of efforts by capital to control democratic processes. And capital either takes the shape of prime ministers who are simply media moguls, or it takes the shape of these peculiar people who are either Australian or American or British, or suddenly, briefly, I think Roman Catholic even, though he may be playing that down on his Twitter account, and who are able to drive common sense in the political arena. And you see it also in astonishing recent Supreme Court decisions in the United States, upping the capacity of capital to simply invest in election outcomes. And you see the same pressure here to permit a wider access to the political arena for money. And you see this in manifest, in the way in which families seem to inherit power, even in democracy. The Bush family in America, you see the return of Berlusconi. These things are creatures of the way in which the universalism of democracy is being rolled back by money. Secondly, the rule of law. The rule of law is an easier one. During a week in which the government in this country is proposing secret courts. Now, I read the Kafka for this LSE festival that's on the moment, and I was really amazed by how Kafka's got secret advocates, special advocates exactly right. He describes in the trial lawyers he's not allowed to speak to, who are not allowed to speak to him. And it's easier to say how clear it is that we are familiarizing ourselves with the idea that we can now have administrative detention, administrative controls. There isn't a court case that decides these. If we allege torture, there will be a secret proceedings which nobody knows about, in which our allegations will be considered by a, I've no doubt, security vetted judge. The world of Guantanamo, which sort of has survived, has now become entrenched in the American system with modified safeguards. The world of Belmarsh has turned itself into, via control orders, the world of terrorism prevention investigation measures, with this control and that control and the other control, but not what matters, judicial process. Finally, human rights. Its weakness always was its fitting within the nation-state system. And, of course, after 11 September 2001, the United Nations has promoted an alternative imperative, which is counterterrorism. So countries that previously found themselves under stress in with regard to their human rights record are able to counter criticism with the exigencies of the counterterrorism situation and the demands that the UN has imposed on them to engage in counterterrorism. So take our own Home Secretary, Theresa May, who, when Gary McKinnon is faced with extradition to the United States of America, remembers the Human Rights Act and says, notwithstanding the courts having said there's no human rights issue, that his health raises such human rights concerns, as does the process in America, that we won't send him. But Babar Ahmad, who is a terrorist suspect with a different kind of name, is sent to a maximum security jail in the United States without really any serious consideration of it. And we're told that Parliament's going to be asked to pass laws that allow, notwithstanding human rights, the courts to order the expulsion of people who are foreign, where their judgment is that they are a threat to the state, notwithstanding any torture, inhuman, degrading treatment, or violence they may face abroad. In other words, we are becoming familiar with an idea that most of the people in this audience respect are not going to be victims of neo-democracy. We have relative assets, we're the right colour, we're not trying to shake the system up, so the rule of law will work for us, and democracy will work for us, and human rights will kind of work for us, but we have it all already. But the guys on the margins who challenge the system are going to find a different kind of set of rules for them, and it's up to a point being ever thus. I wouldn't make any claim about any golden age, but there is the possibility that this is going to become routine. America killing American citizens abroad, but not with American-looking names. The terrorism prevention investigation measures, foreigners always, etc., etc. To track freedom, liberty, and security for the privileged. Thank you.
Are you at all worried that your argument can be used as an argument against human rights?
I am utterly, completely convinced that the route towards what I describe, liberty and security for all, is a kind of social democracy that is pretending to be a kind of legal theory. Human rights, as I describe it, is a form of social democracy, which means it's working through systems of democracy and the rule of law for a wide and rich reading of human rights. The vulnerability of that is to those who say that you are complacent, that you are feeding an unequal system, and I think I just have to make my stand and say your alternatives will cause greater harm and greater misery, and this is the important post-1989 point, won't even succeed in their own terms, and you'll end up living a lie.
If I could pick any measure which I thought was a logical consequence of the argument in your book, it would be the abolition of private schools.
It's more having the discussion about inequality, which causes people, honestly, to raise issues like not just abolition of private schools, but let's say the fact that they are charities and have exemptions from VAT. The fact that when the Charity Commission looked into this, the definition of public benefit was held to include ransacking the state sector for the better pupils to make sure that they could go to the private schools. Myself, I would start with a much more demanding public benefit test of state schools or private schools. You may know state schools have to take hard-to-place children. State schools have to take special needs children. So why don't the private schools, if they want to discharge a public benefit, take their share of hard-to-place children and special needs children? That would be a really important contribution.
You know they've gone to the independent schools partially precisely to avoid such a thing.
And I want to flush it out.